The next session in today's industry trends section would be flat glass recycling in Europe and the United States, the state of play and challenges for enhanced circularity. I would like to introduce my co-presenter, Bertrand Cazes. I'm sure you've all heard about him last night, and of course he will be here presenting with me on this.
Thank you, Urmilla. I guess I don't need to present you, Urmilla, because she's our chair for this session. We'll try to give a bit of a panel of what's happening both in the US and Europe. And let's get going.
That's okay. We'll just... here we go. So the National Glass Association in North America and Glass for Europe, we've had some discussions in the past, maybe about a year and a half or two, about recycling of flat glass. And we wanted to do this presentation together just to show what's happening here in Europe as well as in North America, and some of our comparabilities and some of our strengths and where we can learn from each other. So today we'll be discussing some of these. So for the National Glass Association, we have all of course, the United States, Canada and Mexico being North America. We have 4 flat glass manufacturers within our 1,800 membership companies. Cardinal, Guardian Glass, Pilkington North America, which is part of the NSG group, and Vitro Architectural Products. There's also 10 chapter associations, meaning out of the 50 states that we have, there's 15 states that have the chapter association. So you have the national body of associations, and then there's also chapter ones that try to help with some of the initiatives and the goals of the National Glass Association. And our purpose is to, of course, be the authority and to advocate, to promote, to grow, and educate the glass and glazing industry.
I don't need to say much about Glass for Europe because it was presented by my colleague Eva earlier. Maybe just one word to highlight sustainability, growth, and value. We speak a lot about sustainability, but the only way to make it happen is also by bringing growth and value to the sector. Hence, this mission that is ours in bringing all that up as the EU moves towards climate neutrality.
So as was discussed a little bit earlier, but definitely we'd like to go in a little bit more in depth, the benefits of flat glass recycling. Some of the key facts and figures, to about 2 to 3% of the reduction in energy consumption for every 10% of cullet in the batch. So it's 2 to 3% of the complete reduction, and 1 ton of cullet to save 1.2 tons of raw materials. I think this is something that's incredibly significant to look into, is because of the raw materials that you're able to save by just having your cullet there. And of course, you have 310 kilograms of CO2 from flat glass manufacturing itself, and then of course you have the 600 kilograms of CO2 from from the use of raw materials accounted for as well by just having the cullet as part of recycling. Did you want to add anything here? And recycling, of course, ticks all of the boxes of sustainability right now. There's industry demand, which is, of course, sustainable products. There's environmental product declarations that were discussed a little bit yesterday in some of the sessions. Increased energy efficiency, reduced CO2 emissions. It's also for saving resources, raw materials, energy, and, of course, carbon again. And then you have the policy pressure. The circular economy, the sustainability parts of it, and the environmental policy, knowing that we cannot get to our goals unless we have some of these drivers. In North America, there has been more of an increase in green codes and government procurement programs. We're seeing a lot more of that. In my next presentation after this, we'll get in a little bit more details as to how the government is actually putting in some more money into some of these programs. We're also seeing an increased number of environmental product declarations that's setting the limits for embodied carbon for some of our glass and glazing products.
Maybe one word to say, without giving a hint to the conclusion, that probably the biggest difference in the drivers for more circularity in Europe versus North America is probably the policy pressure. And the policy pressure has been there for a very long time in Europe, and it keeps increasing. We heard about climate neutrality, but the same is true in terms of circularity, recycling, and so that's probably what we will see coming up next.
There's three sources of cullets, of course. So on the beginning of the circular part, it's the internal cullet for the flat glass manufacturers. The cutoff of the production line, the parts it's the edges as well as the defects, and that accounts for about 15 to 20% of all the melted glass. And then you have the pre-consumer cullet. This is cutoffs and the transformation of the process. So this goes between the flat glass manufacturer to the processor or the fabricator. And losses vary from depending on yield and then, of course, breakage that happens. And then the end-of-life products. This is glazing from the actual window replacement, building refurbishment, demolition, of course, old automotive pieces, and solar glass from PV panels as well. So these are the three different parts that we have sources of cullet from.
Maybe one word to say that even though the share of the three parts look the same on this graph, they're not necessarily the same. We are quantifying them in Europe, and they are not all of equal size, but it's not an easy figure to find out, to be honest. So what about the state of play? Well, in Europe, already today, you have about 26% of your batch that is made of glass cullet. But I warn you that this figure starts being a bit old. 2019, I think it was an average of figures 2016-17, but the figure was released in 2019. So it starts getting old, and we suspect that this value is now much higher. We will do a collection exercise in the coming years. So we'll have fresh data probably at next GPD to show. Now, how do you achieve this? Well, it's mostly today by way of course, all the internal cullet that's generated on site. All of that is taken care of. And a lot of work over the last years to work between the manufacturers and the processors and their clients to organize reverse logistics and therefore have this cullet that's generated in the processing site, the pre-consumer cullet, to go back to the float glass manufacturing and being recycled. However, the end-of-life source of cullet, the old glazing, some of it comes back, but it's still extremely marginal compared to what is out there. So that's why I explained yesterday that our next challenge is how we tackle the end-of-life part.
In North America, it's a little bit different. So 25% of the glass cullet it's back into the float glass manufacturer, but it also comes from the flat glass process. It's mostly made up of internal and pre-consumer. That's as it's going towards the fabricator or the processor. Where it comes to post-consumer, end of life, it does not go back into the float glass plants again, because there's so much. There's not the infrastructure that you have here in Europe to where you're able to get that cullet back in very cleanly. So right now, we're looking at more infrastructure to be able to do this a little bit better, like how Europe is doing this. Many discussions are, trying to save the 80% or so that's going into the landfill. We know that this is something in which we can certainly work on more in the United States, and then just getting it, if you're able to just get it out of the landfill, and then whether it be a downstream end of life, it's end of life for the glass industry, however, it's something that goes into a different industry. But right now there's many discussions, but the lack of infrastructure is not allowing us to do this.
So in Europe, clearly for us, the biggest challenge, as I explained yesterday, is how we go and collect this end-of-life glazing. Nowadays, it's almost never recycled into flat glass product. Most of it goes either to landfill. Another big part is used as aggregates for infrastructures and building roads. And some shares of this is used by other glass sectors, by the container glass industry, by the glass wool industry, that can use also the type of cullet we are after. So the challenge for us is, of course, how do we get our hand on this cullet in a way that its quality, its purity level is guaranteed so that we can reuse it in flat glass manufacturing, because flat glass manufacturing requires the highest quality specification for cullet. And therefore, as soon as you enter this debate, you have huge challenges. It's about collecting this glass before the building is demolished and doing it at source. But that's extremely costly, so you need to have a scale that is adequate. So you'd think, okay, a big high-rise building, it's probably easier to do it there than to collect the glass coming from residential windows. Yes, maybe, because you have the scale, but you don't necessarily have the space in a big city to have those big containers available. Then, of course, you have to transport it. So it's also, that also has a cost, an economic one, but a climate cost. And you have to account this to make sure that it makes sense to collect this glass. Plus, then, of course, all the challenges inside flat glass manufacturing plants to make sure that you're not bringing in impurities that would damage your installation or that would, at the end of the day, lead to an output and the glass quality that is not good enough. All of that needs to be put in place, and the industry in Europe is working a lot on that, but you have to reach a cost-benefit balance. And you're doing that when you have competitors from other glass sectors that can accept lower quality cullet than you and are also willing to pay a high price to access this cullet. So there's also that element of competition between the glass sectors that's important as we develop the solutions there. No?
Just going to say, just in addition to that, definitely the cost-benefit ratio in North America as well. But again, where it comes to, like he was mentioning, you can have, a bin there to collect all of the glass. However, what happens now at that? And so there isn't a way or a path right now to go back into the flat glass float plant manufacturing process. However, it might be into roads or different types like that. Last night, I don't know if many of you noticed that there's a part of a highway in Philadelphia that collapsed after a tanker caught on fire. And so this morning I was looking at the news, and they said they're actually going to use some of the cullet to actually help rebuild this. So that's where some of the materials going into. It's not back into the glass industry, however, other industries.
I mentioned that there are a lot of work happening there. I won't name them all. I think there are people from Arab in here who've worked on this project, so they could explain you more what they've done with this great building in Scotland. But you see some machinery development to separate the glass from the window frame, to crush the glass. There are efforts done where we take part with other industries on delamination for the laminated glass, new facilities for cleaning cullet, even on-site, on the floor glass manufacturing site. And in some regions of Europe, like in the Netherlands, you have an extended producer's responsibility scheme to finance the collection of the glass and the logistics behind all of this. So you have all these mushrooming of initiatives. Now, clearly, we will still need to improve a lot of things, because these are all the steps that needs to happen, particularly if we look at the replacement market, window replacement market, so here more residential. And indeed, we have still some challenges where we need innovations to make things happen in terms of logistics, in terms of glass treatment, and in terms of machinery, because ultimately we need the fine quality to ensure the fine quality of the glass that we produce at the end. And yeah, I think this is not the conclusion, but almost the hint I mentioned earlier. Fundamentally, the biggest difference is not what needs to happen either in America or the US, that is more or less the same, but how much legislation drives it. In Europe, we heard about the climate neutrality objective, but that is a major driver. Because the European industry has to pay for carbon, a high price, it might become at some point more interesting to have more recycled glass coming in, because even if that also has a cost, your economic balance is reached earlier. So an important driver. Also obligations in terms of resource efficiencies, in terms of sustainability in buildings with minimum recycled content in your product, obligations with embodied carbon obligations, and so on. So a lot of policy pressure here.
And like I mentioned before, in North America, where it comes to the policy pressures, they were there, but now there is more of a policy pressure. Now there's actually bills, and that's being written, and acts are being passed that says, and have a little bit more meat on there. I think yesterday in the talks, it was like you need the carrot and the stick. So now in the U.S. and North America, we're seeing the stick comes. And so President Biden created a national climate task force with pretty much the mandate to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below the 2005 levels. This is 2005 levels by 2030. Another goal was to reach 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2035. And then achieving a net zero emissions economy by 2050, very similar to over here as well. There's also delivering 40% of the benefits from federal investments in climate and clean energy to disadvantaged communities. So these are the communities that have, single pane glass, for example, that's been there for quite some time. And so there's a lot more pressure on policy on there. There's also the U.S. Resource Conservation Act that governs the waste disposal, like was mentioned before. What happens to that glass now in a retrofit marketplace? In Canada, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act governs the air and water pollution, waste management, and toxics. So in the glass and glaze industry, it would be also the waste management. And then the local initiatives is just emerging more and more at the state and local levels as well. But like I mentioned, flat glass is not included there yet. It's just trying to take care of becoming more of a recycling and sustainable area.
Yeah, I think the conclusions we gave a hint to them earlier. Of course, the benefits of recycling are apprehended in the same way in North America as they are in Europe. The societal expectations for more sustainability might be slightly stronger in Europe, but they are coming up in the US as well. That is part of the trend. And across both sides of the Atlantic, what are the low-hanging fruits? That's already being taken care of by industry. But of course, there are big challenges to recycle all glazing, and indeed in Europe, for the policy pressure reasons, the carbon cost pressure, the energy cost, which is also a lot more expensive in Europe than in the US, we have a strong policy, regulatory, and economic incentive to go faster and deeper in getting that resources. And I can only reassure you that the number of projects I hear about and I see, and that we will hear again today and tomorrow in GPD, is clearly a sign that the needle is moving. It's moving fast, and the 26% I mentioned earlier, I'm confident this number will be much, much higher when I stand in front of you at the next GPD.